There are two bits to this. One is some pre-prepared things, which I'll explain about in just a minute. And then I've been trying to bring together and reflect from my own investigations things that I have done and want to respond to some of the various papers. I can't respond to everybody, but I think I'm covering something from everybody. And then picking up one or two things that Magnus said about future directions in research, which, and some or all of that might be fodder for discussion or what's gone before. I think it's worth saying, I mean, I've had a sort of parallel career of in universities, but also as a practicing church musician and as a liturgist, and for 7 years a member of the Church of England Liturgical Commission. So it's very much with that liturgical musical interplay and a practice and scholarship that I speak. As Bert said, I was here 2 years ago reporting, just as we were finishing editing the first lot of videos from our project, and tried to present what we've been doing. And what emerges very important, I think, out of this is the use of enactment. I refuse to use the word of reconstruction. You can reconstruct a text, you cannot reconstruct a performance. And enactment always happens in the present. And I think what we've heard all the way historically today is you can say that happened there with those people at that point. And you can make connections, but you have to do so with care. And what we did was to work in late medieval buildings, one large, one small. What starts to come out of that is this awareness that our dependence on text, if we're historians and musicologists, or when I presented this in terms of talking to cultural anthropologists, social anthropologists, cultural studies people, or sociologists of religion, is that they overemphasize sight as a means of observation. An interesting thing has just come out from Tilburg, where I went out there and gave 2 papers and had sent stuff in advance. And the response papers have just been published. I can't remember what the name of the Dutch liturgical studies volume is. Can you remember it? Well, it doesn't matter. Anyway, it comes out of that. But this awareness that physical things, sensory things, emotional and intellectual, are really important in your experience of any worship, but particularly in medieval worship, where text, if you're not a Latin speaker, both in the sense of not articulating it and also not understanding it. I think the other thing, and this goes on from Collingwood and others, is the importance of imagination in reenactment. And some of our people really did enter into real issues of imaginative, what would it have been like if I were somebody doubting the Catholic line and leaning to Protestantism in a broadly Catholic pre-Reformation church. There's a very good interview done by Stefan Scott on the website of his experience of doing that and what he felt in acting that out. Of practical experiments, some of which Magnus has talked about, and above all the provisionality in historical research in this area, because such a low percentage of data is available and has survived. Just to plug the project website, www.experienceofworship.org.uk, which is where there is 15 hours of videos, some of them deliberately introductory. I'm delighted that Yale School of Sacred Music Studies are reviving a course on the basis of this on our other website on Sarah Customaries. Hundreds of stills, lots of performance texts, diaries and reports. It's actually a research resource into how we research in its own right. Now, what I want to do first of all is to talk about 3 short case studies to related late medieval and early modern soundscape, To start off with actually something which we did last October in Connecticut, in St. John's Church, Washington, in the sort of rather nice foothills there, which was actually enacting Holy Communion in 1552 as part of American Serum, the second conference we've done, which was about the legacy of Serum. Secondly, to talk about the soundscape inside the church and to take data from just after 1400, and then the soundscape outside the church, again from a specific case study that covers from the mid-15th to the mid-17th century. My first study is to do with the 15 to 52, and we did this on the Saturday with a mixture of clergy and musicians who'd come to this, and everybody in the conference took part. And I asked them to go through the experience of a 1552 Holy Communion service. And what was in our minds was, how did a priest cope with the fact for perhaps 10, 20, 30 years he'd been celebrating Latin Mass? He'd gone through one stage of reform in 1549 where things were all in English, and now he was going through a second stage where it is radical, you know, and we can look at the visual contrast. On the left is the elevation at Our Lady Mass in St. Pilo's Church. Are those pictures clear enough, or do we need to switch off the lights here? Is it a bit shame? Is that better? Yeah, tilting the blinds would be good. The view inside the chancel of a very engaged group of people, and the view from the nave where you can just see what's going on, but the people at the back haven't a chance of seeing that elevation, even though they're crowding there. And the contrast of the gathering in the chancel of all the people for Holy Communion in 1552, and I'm afraid I don't have the source for that, some of you might know it, but I just stole it off the internet. And Hale's Church, which shows the long ways holy table, the benches round the outside. Yes, they could be used for singers, but here for the congregation to gather those who are going to stay for communion. And to think about the different sound experience that you have. Obviously Latin versus English vernacular. And since I live in Wales, I'm well used to going into a room where I don't understand, well, I understand a few of the words, and the danger is I misconstrue them. The fact that in 1552 and indeed 1549 as well, 100% of what is said is heard, whereas only 30% of what the priest and singers articulate is heard in the Latin Mass. And from that also, that long periods of silence, particularly in the canon of the Mass, and Roger Bowers, you can hear speaking eloquently about the impact of that on some of the videos on the website. That chanting is the norm. When it says Dixit, he says, actually it means he sings most of the time. Whereas, obviously, as Magnus said this morning, spoken word is the norm. Musical embellishment, now musical functionality, no preaching, probably in the Mass, separate thing. And a homily, and it was an incredibly powerful moment in that 1552. The impact of that Cranmerian prose. We used actually some of they're actually pre-Reformation homilies, but they were still authorised. The separation that we've seen in that image of the nave and the chancel, the distance of the priest who faced eastwards, he only turns around to the people 5 times, I think, to say, "The Lord be with you," and then back he goes, and the action of the altar. Whereas that transition, and that in Connecticut, everybody moved and knelt on the hard chancel floor, I might say, for about 25 minutes, to fully experience the physical delights of 1552. You can see why they're opposition to me, on a purely practical point of view. And the immediacy of the priest. The sonic experience is in a wider context of the visual, the olfactory, with incense vestments, ritual gestures. And And whereas the sonic emphasis is raised in 1552 because other things have gone. And to see a priest who, and Jeremy Davis who did it, had done all our enactments, who'd been so, 70-something manual acts you do in the canon of the Mass, and for him just simply to take the bread, take the wine, and no other action. A huge contrast. And you can see how the people not only saw this close to, but also very conscious of how different that was from their previous experience. So there it is, just having thought about the contrasts. And I'm sorry I couldn't record it, but that wasn't what we were about now. Okay, my second case study has to do with the remarkable set of inventories found in the register of John Chandler, Dean of Salisbury, as a provisional indicator of the soundscape inside the medieval church circa 1400. Given the very limited information that survived beyond the buildings themselves, how could one possibly be sure of the soundscape inside parish churches and chapels? One indicator is the presence of books. Church wardens' accounts give some indication of the purchase and repair of books, but rarely of their extent. Inventories are a better source of information where they exist. I want to look at the implication of the inventories taken in certain parishes in the Diocese of Salisbury. These are found in the register made when John Chandler was Dean of the Cathedral between 1404 and 17. In all, 61 churches and chapels, 7 chantries and 1 priory fell within the jurisdiction of the Dean and are listed in these inventories, spread across the diocese, Dorset, Wiltshire and Berkshire. And the vestments go into a great deal about, the inventories go into a great deal about the vestments, the ritual artifacts and the books found in each church. And in some cases they state or they note the state or age of the book, and some entries note the presence of music. The evidence is striking from that group of whatever it is, 69. 595 volumes are listed, and some of those are composite volumes. And in the case of 180, the presence of music is noted specifically. Now, if we just focus on the 61 churches and chapels, i.e. the parish institutions, there are 554 books. That's an average of 9 manuscript books per church or chapel, which I found an extraordinarily high number. The minimum in certain of the smaller chapels is 1, just a missal. The maximum is 25 at Wantage, which actually at that stage also counted as a chapel. But 6 other churches have 16 or more liturgical books. The presence of music is noted in 108 of them. That represents about 20%, but that proportion needs to be treated carefully. Firstly, some books are unlikely ever to contain music, books of lesson readings, for instance. Second, these inventories were compiled over a period and by different people and garnered in from the visitations. Those making the lists may not have all been bothered to distinguish books containing musical notation, especially where they were taken for granted. The other thing is that I have relied on the abstracted published versions. I haven't worked on the original manuscripts, because that was part of, again, the thesis here about how do you use published editions and what are their limitations when you're collecting data. None of the 25 books at Wantage is listed as containing music, for instance, though as many as 18 may have done so because of their type. On the other hand, at Netheravon, 10 of the 14 books are noted as containing music. Antiphoners, graduals, processionals are most likely to contain music, as well as some of the breviaries and missals, the so-called noted breviaries and noted missals. And if we analyse the distribution of these books, quite remarkably, it becomes apparent that 46 of the 61 churches and chapels have sufficient combinations of books to enable them to sing both the office and the Mass. Now, of course, owning a book, as you well know, is not the same as using it. And in a small chapel, perhaps staffed by a single chaplain, a daily Mass may literally have been said, though I think it may have been in a rather mannered way, closer to intonation. On the other hand, it's evidence that provision was made in the larger prebendal churches to gather sufficient clergy, and no doubt some laymen and children too, for special days. And so to a different source of evidence. This was evidently the intention of the prebendal church of Great Bedwin, which is in northern Wiltshire, in the Savannah Forest. At the Dean's visitation on the 10th of May 1409, it was found that the priests of 4 of the 7 dependent chapels were failing to attend Great Bedwin on greater feast days, i.e. double feasts, as required. Now, Great Bedwin owned 20 books, at least 5 of which are noted as containing music. Although the priests were failing in the duty, the expectation was that there would be sufficient clergy to celebrate the full ritual and chant on greater feast days. You need 3 at the altar, and that still leaves 4 to sing, let alone any additional singers. Now, it may be that some of the 20 books of Great Bedwin were used on selected feast days, not every day. And in the last year, I've been working with Graham Bathe, who works on the Seymour Estates. And the Seymour Estate papers include a number of wrappers taken from at least 6 liturgical books, probably all 13th or early 14th century. And there's a fragment of the Missal which was used to wrap the Shalborne Eastcourt survey, and actually includes a very important Gloria, which I won't bore you with. So we actually have, for the first time, fragments of music from the Diocese of Salisbury. They don't really exist even in the cathedral, but these are actually, you can place them within the diocese, and quite possibly in that group of churches around Great Bedwin, which is where the Seymours had their most important house. Okay, third case. They're all very brief, as you can see, which is the soundscape outside the church to look at some provisional indicators. I'm a bit sorry that the nice people from Berkswell have gone, because this is all about bells. Because in the late Middle Ages, the most common ecclesiastical sound outside church is that of bells. The handbell of the clerk or sexton proceeding ahead of the priest to visit the sick or dying, and those are inventoried by Dean Chandler's visitors. The bells of the church signalling the times of services, and I'll come back to that in some of the commentaries to answer bits about Wyndham. The elevation of the host at Mass, we've seen a sacring bell in the flesh. I'm surprised it was inside. The one I know about are outside. Or tolling the knell of the dead. And where there was a clock and time becomes increasingly important, the marking of the hours. But bells also contributed to celebrations. We've heard something about that from the Brabant example. It becomes clear that this was not a single bell, but several. And I want to concentrate on the evidence of one church, that of St Edmund's, Salisbury. St Edmund's, to answer Magnus, was both a collegiate church and a parish church. And I'm hoping that Sally Wadsworth here is going to work on St Edmund's for her MA thesis. I've sort of handed over my notes to her, so that she can look at the relationship of the collegiate and the parish more and start to unpick what is a remarkably detailed set of church warden's accounts from the mid-15th century right up to the late 17th century. I'm not going down past 1653 when the tower collapsed, probably because of too much ringing. It's a central tower, so very hard to strengthen. That's a problem, and of course Wyndham solved it by building a second tower. From the number of entries concerned with the maintenance and repair of bells, it appears that St Edmund's was absolutely obsessed with them. From an entry of 1490, we know that the bells were hung on wheels. And that's important. The nice lady who worked on Church Warden's Council is gone, isn't it?
Yes, Valerie.
Yeah, that's a shame, because this is a very early date, I think, for wheels. Indeed. The earliest stocks, and again I've seen the more important, I didn't note that down, but I can remember it was 1510. And the first reference to staves, that means the bells going right the way around, is 1601, which again is very early for change ringing. And there was evidently a goodly pool of ringers to draw on. Indeed, in 1568, 12 ringers were paid for ringing at the anniversary of the coronation day of Queen Elizabeth, which answers another question about something. I think that's 2 teams of 6, because I think by then they got 6 bells. Now, what I'm interested to observe here, though, is not so much the technique of bell ringing, but the changes in the use over the Reformation period. Before the Reformation, there was the regular pattern of ringing for services conducted both by the clergy of the college and those of the parish. There are also the special payments for ringing, especially during the procession season, broadly late May, June. St. Mark's Day, Rogation Day is Ascension Day, the Thursday after Whit Sunday, which is apparently Procession Day, and Corpus Christi. And in some years, from Monday to Thursday during Holy Cross Week. In the 15 years for which we've got the Church Warden's accounts, between 1462 and 1543, where there's specific evidence, there are 4 years with payments for ringing on St. Mark, 12 Rogation Day, 6 on Ascension, 12 on Procession Day, and 10 on Corpus Christi. But of course, you know, they're selective. Between 1549 and 1553, the pattern changes. Payments for ringing are now noted at 5 a.m. and 7 p.m. In 1549 and 50. And the reason I think that's happening is the college is gone. That was probably a college duty to ring for morning and evening prayer. It's now come across the parish. On 20 Saints' Eves in 1550, on Christmas Eve, Candlemas Eve, Whitsun Eve, variously between 1551 and 53. And we start to get the early instances of royal ringing, in 1547 for the death of Henry VIII, 1552 for the visit of Edward VI to Salisbury, and in 1553 for the proclamation of the new Queen. During the reign of Mary, it's much as before the Reformation, Rogation Tide, Ascension Day, Whitsun, Corpus Christi, Christmas Eve, and so on. Now, during the early period of Elizabeth, then it's morning and perhaps evening prayer, it's not entirely clear, on Saturdays and even on some Saints' Eves. Then it changes again from 1568, ringing to mark the anniversary of the Queen's coronation was instituted. Berkswell referred to that going on in their town. And 1589 for the Queen's birthday and for Triumph Day to mark the anniversary of the defeat of the Spanish Armada. This was alongside ringing for Easter, Christmas, Easter, Ascension and Whitsun, and in some years for Candlemas, Dancing Day and Midsummer's Day. What we're observing is a shift from liturgical ringing to state and social or civic ringing. And from 1592 to the end of Elizabeth's reign, the pattern of payments is consistent, ringing on Saturdays, Christmas Day, Easter Day, Whitsun Day, Coronation Day, the Queen's birthday, and Triumph Day. Then in 1597, for the coming of Lord Pembroke, from 1597 there's a new kind of ringing to mark aristocratic progress or visit to Salisbury. And I've eliminated those for the bishop, which again Berkswell referred to being fined when the bishop went through the parish for not ringing, which also goes on when the bishop visits the church. Not when he's in town, because it's too often. In 1597 for the coming of Lord Pembroke, in 1599 for the coming of Lord and Lady Pembroke, and of course they're living at Wilton House, just outside Salisbury. In 1602 for the Earl of Hertford passing through the town, and there are royal ringings as well going on when the King and Queen are in the town or passing through. And then there's a change in 1611, there's ringing to the King going to the hunt. And perhaps the most trivial ringing occurred in 1646-47, payment for ringing the race day that the Earl of Pembroke, his horse, won the cup. And it's just showing, when you hear, what you're hearing is the same from the tower, but its significance has changed totally. And then, of course, you've got an entry followed then by the more sinister payment for ringing on the public day for the Thanksgiving for the delivering of the castles and forts into the hands of Parliament in the 31st of August 1647, which I think is the Irish castles and forts. There's earlier political ringing, which had been instituted from 1607 to mark the Papist plot, i.e. Gunpowder plot, and Gary's plot. And I think there might be an early one for the Babington plot as well. The changing significance of the soundscape of the ringing of bells is made evident in this survey, and so was the way in which the bells were rung over the same period. For this is the time when change ringing, so characteristic of England, emerged. So 2 points need to be emphasised about the soundscape. The meaning of the sound of the bells changed, and then so too did the sound itself to the pattern schemes of change ringing, though we can't tell when it happened. If you've got wheels and stocks and then stays, when did they start actually systematic patterns of ringing rather than just jangling? As we observed earlier, the bells at St Edmunds were swung with wheels by 1490, 12 ringers paid Coronation Day in 1568, and payments for stays in 1601. And at least by 1630, there were 3/4 bell wheels, which were essential to ringing changes, as we saw when those bells went out and the model bell went up. So by way of coda, I want to turn briefly to Bristol for evidence, and the commonplace book of Philip Powell of Brecon, on which my wife has done much more work than me, though this is my own contribution. Though the chapter she did in the book there, Bearers of Song, is much fuller by definition. But it doesn't do what I'm about to do. Philip Powell, a Welshman from Brecon, was imprisoned in Newgate Jail in Bristol in March 1633, and between then and March 1634, he recorded a series of 14 tables of changes. As you can see there, a table of change to be rung on the bells, very good and easy. And there are also melodies for chimes, some psalm tunes and also some popular melodies. And that's the first page of changes. That's the second, in which you also get something about gunpowder, I think. And the one we're going to hear is this one. Now, we don't know whether Powell's writing down what he hears in the Bristol Towers around Newgate Jail, which is in the centre of Bristol, where there are plenty of churches to listen to, or whether they were compiled from other sources, or whether he actually invented some, because there are some mistakes in the numbers. At least one matches a standard plain hunt, and the people from Bucks will have told you a plain hunt is one where number 5, the tenor bell, goes through consistently. And it's just a systematic going through permutations. But one of them matches an earlier compilation made by Lawrence Charity of Halesworth in Suffolk, around 1620. So here then, marked in red, is the change of one of Powell's tables of changes. And I'm going to play it, not wrong line, I'm afraid, but by courtesy of Sibelius software. I'm glad in that sense the bell ring is on here to hear this effect on Sibelius synthesized tubular bells. 22 changes. And what I've done is repeat each one. Now, if any of you are keyboard players, because what's odd is, whereas you tend to think of 1 being the lowest note and 5 being the high, it's actually the other way around. So you have to play these changes with your left hand, if anybody knows what I'm talking about, keyboard fingering. And then you can understand it. And I've set them all out in modern, and here it goes. So that's 0. Now we're into the first change. tenor range of magnet control is bell bong. Okay. Now I wanted to, is it all right now if I go on to some general comments on the day? I mean, it's obviously difficult, particularly since there was no gap between Jonathan's paper and me standing up, to answer, sort of collect all my thoughts. So I'm going to sort of work through, I hope, in a sort of reasonably coherent. It might be useful for me to have some lights if that's possible now, since I can see some scribbled pencil notes. Thanks ever so much. Perhaps I can start with the notion, start from the paper on the music of the plastic household, which I'd never thought about, so that's really, really good. But I do want to recall the question of all that music that William Byrd, as a leading requisite, publishes extraordinarily, in particularly the Latin Masses and then the Gradualia, as to where on earth and how on earth those were used. If any of you are Catholics, particularly to the rural area, as I do, and I will see, as I'm not Catholic, but know what's going on, then what happens if there's no priest to say Mass? One of the interesting things that John Milson put forward was, might some of this music be actually sung around the table in a Catholic household? So actually sing the Mass of the Assumption of the Blessed Virgin Mary, with all the propers that he set, and the matching ordinary, as a means of celebrating Mass. It's an interesting question. I don't know there's any evidence of it, but clearly something went on. And the more important thing, which I think I want to stress, as being, I think, key to how we look at particularly the place of sacred music after 1559, is the relationship between what goes on in the house and what goes on in the church. That the connections, I think, are far closer than we're often willing to take. We tend to think about, profane music and sacred music. And I think there's a great deal of embedded music that people are using at home, which they will either recognise or share in church. And I think we just need to think that through about what's going on and how the Reformation, and particularly the availability of printed music, may have affected that. And the connections people then make, even when what they're singing may be a song as with ballads, that you wouldn't remotely use in church. The second point, and it doesn't follow on from that, but I couldn't work out how best to order these, is I want to turn to the bells and remember Bergswell and Wyndham, and to think about pre-Reformation ringing. Some of you may know J.W. Legg's book called The Clerk's Book, which is a reprint of 1549. What sometimes people don't look at, who are pre-Reformation historians, is what appears at the back of that book, which is a lot of job descriptions of parish clerks and what they did, and it tells you an enormous amount about how things were being done in parish churches, or directed to be done, because it didn't mean it was done. And one of the things I discovered, and I can't remember which church it is, but it may be Faversham, but it's one of those there, is the ringing of the bell, or it may be one of the London churches. How you ring the bell before Mass. And this goes to the three bells question, which hadn't occurred to me till I saw you talk about three bells, and Berksville had three old bells. Which is that you ring the first ringing is 20 minutes before Mass. The second ringing is 10 minutes before Mass. And then you go down to see if there's a priest there. And then you ring the last ringing, which is just before Mass begins. Now it just dawned on me, when I was at Magdalen, Oxford, then before evensong, we chimed, if Magnus reminded me of this, it was a 2-bell chime from 6:15, whatever time it was, or 5:45. We'd sing at 6?
Yes.
Yeah, 5:45 till about 5 minutes. And then it went to a single bell. So you knew that you were close, and no, I'm not suggesting that was a medieval practice. But I did wonder if not only did you hear 3 lots of ringing, but you also heard it at different bells. So you knew that was the prompt bell, and you were on the second, that's what the second bell sounds like. I don't know, it'd be worth thinking about, and it's where again sort of, interconnections and a collaborative research might come in. My next point, well, at least we can go with instruments. And I want to, the lovely set, and it's a great picture they finished in 1559, the Churchwarden's accounts of St Mary at Hill, which have been long known because they're published by Little Hales. Well, actually they're not well known, at least because Little Hales is selected and he misses out crucial data, which changes your understanding of a number of things which I'll talk about in a minute. But there, if I remember, the waits lead the wives procession, and that goes from an outside procession into the church with instruments. And there may be just those rare occasions, and we need to look at this more to see what the evidence is of use of instruments. And the best source of this very often is not Churchwarden's accounts, or they may be there, but actually they're often collated in the Reed volumes, Records of Early English Drama, because they're interested in that kind of thing. Then they get picked up there. And that leads me on with St Mary at Hill to the question that somebody raised, Magnus, I think, who paid for the music? And I was trying to get a table, because I really wanted to show it to complement what Jonathan showed you, but I couldn't save it in time and get it onto the stick and then onto the pro, which is what happened at St Mary at Hill when the rector was Alan Percy. Because he arrives as rector in 1521, and he goes right through to 1559. And over the years before Alan Percy arrives, and we're going back to the 14th century, a series of wills show the establishment of chantries. And it's not just to have for their souls, but always for the better performance of divine service. In other words, we were building up a clerical choir. Now, by the beginning of the 16th century, they've, I think, got 6 chantries. So they're spending, from the endowment, about £48 on music. Now, this puts your figures into some sort of context. Now, the church, during the early 16th century, is spending about £8 a year. It doesn't vary very much over that period through the 16th century till 1549. But what you don't see, it's not in Little Hales, you have to go and look at it, is one, they suspend the chantry and divert the money to the singers. Second, the rector puts an increasing number of money in, so that by 1539-40, the total expenditure, excluding the chantries, just what's in the church records, is £51. Now, that's twice your highest number, let alone the extra provision. And I think we need to do much more work across the break. I wish I'd finished my book on choirs and organs 1450 to 1650, which was due to OUP about 15 years ago. I will do it before I'm 70, I promise. That's what it is, that's a promise to myself. Because I think we start to get a sense of proportion. And St Mary at Hill is exceptional. Basically, Alan Percy is a younger son of the Duke of North, is he an Earl or Duke of Earl of Northumberland, thank you. So well connected, and though St Mary at Hill is a tiny parish, a couple of 100 yards long by 50 yards wide, he's using it as a private chapel, basically, and funding. He's got people like Thomas Callis singing there in that very expensive year. So, and that's not only all that comes out of there. So I think we're seeing who pays for music, but that you actually, that's where my secondary sources are totally hopeless, because they don't show you the beautiful detail, which you have to go and look at the beautiful books in the Guildhall Library. And that leads me on, therefore, to put that at the scale of what Jonathan was saying, about what spending. Yes, agreed the spending, but I looked at your mean figure of what was the income, which I reckon was ranging from about 30 to 80, the receipts you were showing for the churches, at the mean black figure, very roughly. Well, 70% of that at St Mary at Hill was being spent on, if you take the figures across, then that's what they were spending on music, let alone the priests they were employing as well. So I think we need to look very carefully about how these things are and what the implications are, because you can see the devastation of the loss of chantries at St Mary at Hill. They could never match it, what they did before. And that's when organs, I think, become more important, because you can replace polyphony, sung polyphony, with played polyphony. But that's something, hopefully you'll get the book sometime. Number 4. Where did they sing? Yes, I want to go back to this. Magnus talked about, we better switch off. You're doing a wonderful job with the mics, thank you. This is a terribly famous book, the Berry Hours. And this is the Sainte Chapelle, and it's Christmas Day, the main mass of the day. I won't go into the arguments that justify that. It's a weird picture because that's the West End and that's the East End. So we have to be careful. And you've got 5 clerks here. Quite clearly, 4 of them are singing from a desk, but not a desk in the centre, but a desk at the side, because here's the opposing desk, where you've got we've got 3 chaplains there, 2 kneeling, and 5 singing. Well, 4 singing, and the other one's singing the angelic music up there. And I think we need to think about how, when we go into parish churches, whether there are medieval desks at the side, whether you might have had a lectern stuck on that in some way for books. It's just, and I'll tell you why I thought that. Last year I ended up marrying Helen Castor actually on telly. Pleased my wife when I used my wedding drink to demonstrate with the ring at the porch. But when we went into the 3rd stage, which was going to the chancel, this remarkable thing when the newly married break through the rood screen. Where they stand is on the right-hand side, interestingly, with the woman nearest the altar. And I then thought back to how we used to sometimes and thought, should we put the singers on the right-hand side of the desk rather than the centre facing east, blocking the rood screen and the way through? It was just a thought that occurred to me, and we need to think a bit about that, about the location of choirs. I think after the Reformation they went on singing in the chancel. There's no reason why they should sing anywhere else, really. It's where you can put books, and you can start to reconstruct little choirs. I've done a bit of work on Ashburton where you can see a bit who's singing, more before the Reformation there. But St Edmund Salisbury, I've done a spreadsheet which you can work out pretty much the range of who's singing, which going to include the parish clerk, possibly the sexton. You can see from their names what they're doing, and other odd people, because that's where Elway Bevan, quite surprisingly, turns up on the list of parish staff, and since he went on to be a vicar call at Wells and composed Bevan Dorian, wasn't it? Then that may well be the case. Now I've got to 4. 5, which raises the question what you use it for, which had been a bit answered by Magnus, because he and I, with Ira Johnson, have asked this question quite a lot about how the organ changes in use. And I think we have to, if we were dealing with the 14th or 15th century, we would not hesitate to use a 14th century source and a 13th century source, even though they're 100 years apart, to try and I think we might need to look at later evidence, because there's so little musical evidence from the 16th century. But if you look at the Psalter, quite often you get publications which say pointed for singing. And all it means is the colon to show where you divide the verse. And the evidence, again, John Milson has done work on this, is that people went on singing chants, psalms, to the old plain song tones. So parish singers who actually did survive the Reformation could carry on doing what they did before. They simply do it in English. And I don't see why at morning and evening prayer, and Jonathan was pointing to this really, that shouldn't be going on. That's really the answer to the singers, which was going on the next point, sorry. But the organs, I think, must then, when you've got small bodies of people, if you've got an organ, may well have started to be used for accompaniment at that period, particularly the hard part, that's to say the bass part. And most often in organ parts you've got the treble and the bass and some bits and filling in. And I think we need to have a round table or something where we've got the historians, the musicologists, the liturgists, and those who span both to talk about some of this to take this research forward, because I think, and to look pre and post-Reformation and see what might have gone on, particularly those churches where there are good records both sides of the Reformation, like St Edmund Salisbury happens to be an example of that. I think we also have to look at what Jane Flynn has been doing about the tuition of choristers and the way in which pre-Reformation organ music, or certainly Marian organ music, is being used for teaching in the 1560s and 70s, and all the skills they're being taught are solid skills that are, you can see before the Reformation. So there's a skills-based teaching which enables us to see that the musical skills that musicians had, even in parishes, might be the same. I'm nearly at the end of my list. 7. Oh yeah, I just did want to, last time I was here I met Joanne Anderson, which some of you may know. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Joanne showed me a manuscript from, I don't know the village she was working on, and I don't know the call number of this manuscript, because she was going to go out to Trent, where it is, in Trento, in northern Italy, and photograph it all for me. But this is the beginning, as you can see here, of the Mass of the dedication. This is a fun little book, and I looked from the folios that she sent me. Then what you get is a kind of selection. This is going back to my great Bedouin point, which is that there seem to be books which actually, and there are some in the inventory saying certain masses in a book. And I'm just wondering whether you've got a group, and which is what I suggested to her 2 years ago, and then we haven't taken it forward, but it's worth mentioning. A book where you put in the things you need, but not everything. And nearly everything here has to do with special saints' days, supported by Kyrie. So you've got a series of books here, from an antiphona, a gradual, sequentiary. You then have stuff for from an antiphona and from a psalter, and actually from a hymnal as well. So it looks like a compilation book for when you got singers there at that particular little church. It's a tiny church, isn't it, there, in the Tyrol. And whether this shows that even on the continent, there's provision that you get people together for special occasions, for double feasts, if you like. I think that to finish, to go back to some general issues, we raised them on the way. Magnus raised this question of mapping, having been quite, and there's clearly lots more data to share, and there was conversation going on at lunch about how can we share all the data that we variously gathered in different levels of comprehensiveness, but at least you can see people going off to other things. And I suppose my approach has always been to look at one set of accounts or one institution in great detail and try and understand it. Because I think at that stage, I felt that was a counteraction to the mapping. But I'm always aware that though that says, that answers my question, which I think is a crucial one, that's what happened in that place at that time with those people. You can create a greater mosaic and build a bigger picture. And it's how I relate that. I think what we explored in the project about the experiential is really important, and I'm hoping that working with the new professor at Birmingham, Andrew Kirkman, we can take that forward a bit more so far as music and some collaboration he's got at Nottingham. With the whole sensory experience, he's primarily interested in the pre-Reformation, and I suppose most of our work has been, but actually extending that beyond as we started to do in Connecticut. And with the experimental, and to risk getting it wrong. I know that what in our videos, there are things I wouldn't do again. And you look back and think, oh gosh, why did we do that? I'm sure it should have, well, what I've said about where should we have sung from. But you can only learn that by doing it. And I would urge everybody to think about producing collaborations in their research where you can try some things out. And now with the whole business of collaboration with non-university sector research, organisations, the willingness of the Heritage Lottery Fund these fragments are being funded, their transcription that I showed you from Salisbury Diocese. Eastern Royal has got a heritage lottery grant to pay for transcribing them, 2 performances and a recording. And it will be a resource for scholarship, but also engagement of the local community. And I think there's lots of willing things we can do on that line. And what we found was how good those people we had as volunteers to enact became researchers as enactors. And their reflections were often as perceptive as those of us. And also, as a researcher, not to sit on the outside, but to get your hands dirty and do it yourself, and see what comes out of it. And then, I think from, again, the whole business of thinking not just about text, but about space, sound, emotion, intellect, the senses, and the very physicality of worship, or of any experience, of the social experience as well. And always thinking about where are you standing. So many people, I think, talk about it all from the congregational aspect. I used to be guilty of doing it all from the clergy and choir, but I've learned a lot of, the interchange of what you can learn from that. And I hope all those things we might throw into the pot, and I'll shut up.
Well, thank you very much. Fantastically, we get, as it were, double bonus by asking John to do this, because very, very important thoughts coming out from the project, and then thoughts that bring our whole day together. So I'm very grateful to you for having agreed to do this. Now, I think we can really open it up very generally. I'm sure there are points you would like to react to from what John just been highlighting. There may be new questions to ask about the project work that has been introduced to us, or indeed there may be other points that you would like to add to what is now meant to be a sort of tour d'horizon of the whole day. So just opening up for any thoughts, suggestions, questions you may have to John or to anybody else in the room. Yeah, Kristen.
I like what you said about thinking about enactment versus reconstruction. It actually made me think about something that I think we take for granted when we talk about experience and action and the senses. And I was wondering if you could clarify how you think about the differences between when you talk about action, practice, and experience when you think of soundscapes, music, and the parish experience. Especially as I worked on my thesis, every time I dealt with, like, say, Pamela Graves or Kate Giles, others who deal with spatial experience, they had better evidence than I felt I had, and I backed off every time I tried to talk about community experience, because I felt like action I could deal with my documents, but not experience. So I'm just curious how you
and that, of course, was the challenge we've had from both historians and from social anthropologists, and our validity of what we're doing. I think what I found myself, and I've struggled with this partly in the early stage of the project, because nearly everything we did in presentations was in front of sociologists and anthropologists and physical geographers, social geographers rather, and you felt totally inadequate, particularly because you couldn't use all their long words. So it's all rooted in, I suppose, my experience of church, which is inseparable. But in what we're doing, and I separated out, and I've just sort of not that long ago revised the chapter that's going into our book, which is going to press, which should be out, which is called Late Medieval Liturgies Enacted. Will be Ashgate, hopefully by the end of the year. I'm not an editor, but Magnus is one of them. Sally, my wife, is another, and Paul Barnwell is the third. Which gives a better narrative, and there's quite a lot on the website where I've tried to talk about the research process and some of the outcomes. But what I found myself writing about was separating experience from engagement. And the experience, I think, can be described because it's actually what hits you. You can't tell about what the response is, but you can articulate very precisely things that you hear, see, smell, feel, tactile. And one of the really important moments for the laity in the Lady Mass was that moment, the only time that somebody comes through from the eastern side of the eastern side of the screen, the rood screen, is to give the peace, which is on a Pax board, and we copied the Pax board from Sandon and Essex. At least we didn't copy, we did nothing. Like with working with the craftsmen, which is another dimension of this project, we let them be creative within a framework. And when they actually physically kissed this, and we know there were great disputes about receiving the Pax board. There's one famous account of a parish where John Brown, I think, orders the clerk to give him the Pax board before somebody else, and the clerk decides otherwise. So at that point in the service, and it might have got a consistory, well, it must have got a consistory call because it's recorded somewhere. Then he breaks the Pax board over the head of the clerk and causes him to bleed in his ankle. It was made of wood. So I think there is this you can measure that, you can observe it happening, you can hear people's responses. I think the engagement thing is interesting, because I think that is where you become much more conscious of the space, the movement, the sound, and how it's affecting you, and you can start to unpick both the sensory responses to it, but especially the physical and the emotional. And I think we tend to exclude emotion from this, but actually we found ourselves feeling things. And I can remember one instance, which was the Jesus Antiphon on the last night we did it on Thursday, where the choir came out of the chancel. It was a new thing. We did do things differently every day, over 3 days, though on the same material, and went into the Jesus Chapel and sang this antiphon, and you just needed to kneel, and everybody did. There were no instructions, and it was actually very, very powerful. Now, that's my personal response. In 2014, I can only record that as it was 2011, I can only record that as what I experienced, and you can read all their diaries online about what people felt at that moment. But that was the way in which I was engaged. And it transformed for a number of people, their whole attitude, eastwardness, because you always go east for prayer, of bowing, because it's not, you're always bound for prayer. And I think you really think about the levels of engagement that you had as laity, as well as the freedom. Linda Woodhead, who's the big project director of Religion Society, was very struck by our project, and saw enormous possibilities for its transference to modern worship. Now, particularly freeing congregations from the tyranny of the text, the tyranny of the pew. You suddenly realise why Elizabethans, or during the 15th, 16th, people put in pews. You can control them. You can keep them in their place, literally, socially, and physically. And so I think those things, does that start to, it's a huge thing, and you have, if you really want it, I'll send you the text of what I've written, and you can challenge it.
Thank you.
If I could just take you back to your the early part of your very interesting lecture. Please forgive me for asking this simple question. It will worry me all the way home if I don't ask it. You talked about the Dean of Salisbury. I think it was the early 15th.
Yes, that's right. 1404.
Right. You also showed some printed music. Now, was that his?
No, we could print it.
I thought it looked like printed to me, and printing only came in.
No, it's manuscript.
Ah, right.
13th century manuscript.
Right, that deals with that.
Yeah.
Can I clarify something on that? Because I completely, I really appreciate all of that, and think also that the need for a combined database, which we were discussing, Magnus earlier, is important. A lot of people in the room have done work on finding music in amongst, say, I think or account and myself. But one of the things that I would make is that everybody, when they give information in, is clear about the status of the parish and the details that they're
Kümin. No, they're not. Only two of them.
But you can see where I'm driving
Yeah.
at, is that there is a need to know whether in some of this, because a lot of the church rules accounts, one of the questions I raised in a long time ago on that EBS collection was, what skew distributions have we got going on here, and how far, if you've got, say, the surviving church rules accounts tend to be of ecclesiastical livings, rather than a more general spread, and we need to be aware of that. Hence also my question earlier about what's particular about the parish, because it might make a big difference.
Well, I think that's why that
that's
purely chance remark in the abstracts in the position is that just because we were trying, the reason I got to this was thinking about the provenance of these fragments. And so I just went through initially just the Great Bedouin references because the sort of, I think that's the most likely place they come from, given though Eastern Royal would like it to be from there, not least since they raised the money. And it's then that I looked at this, and we've often, in doing the, particularly the enactments at St Tyler, which is tiny church. And people have said, oh, there wouldn't be an organ in a church like St Tyler's. Oh, they wouldn't be able to do this. They'd only have, as poor as church in Glamorganshire. Couldn't possibly. Well, actually belong to Leith Abbey, so there might be some hand-me-downs, and who knows what the local family would put in. But I think what interested me about Great Bedouin was this chance find that actually priests from the chapelries were expected to come to the main church on the great feasts, or double feasts, which are about 100 days in the year. So that suggested to me there is actually a strategy, which doesn't mean that every parish church, everything which we would look as the parish church, and I think I need some help distinguishing between what is a chapel and what is a church. And it's quite clear, even in Timmins is unsure of the status. I mean, why is Wantage a chapel if it's got more books than anybody else? And what's going on there? And so I entirely agree. And it's that was just this was the starting point of a new means of inquiry. In fact, I do have a huge spreadsheet which shows exactly what kind of book which is in which place and which was marked as having music in and done all sorts of source. What I don't know is enough about the history of each parish. And that's where I think, you can get this general data and then say, we must particularize on a particular place and its evidence to see if we can possibly put that into it, and then widen the context again. Because you've got to look at everything that's going on in the parish. You just simply can't snip it out, the reference to music or bells. You've got to look at it, how it works, and the whole, and I'm sure you agree.
For me, if I may continue that,
Yeah.
the second thing that's really hit me during the day and made me think a bit more is about the nature of music outside the church and the whole issue of processions and other kinds of music. And I was thinking, going further on that, what kind of music would have accompanied the civic regalia, so to speak, going into a cathedral church on the occasions they went in? Would that have been drums and bagpipes and other things, and would that have been part of what would have alienated kind of the whole problem of when, who uses the civic church and who uses the cathedral at certain points, and the nature of town music? So in other words, some combination of the sort of civic choirs, waits and so on,
Yeah,
and others.
I think we need to be very careful to separate what we mean by processions, because liturgical processions always begin and end in one place, which is the choir of the church from which it starts, or chancellor of the church from which it starts. And you get categories. And the other thing that I'll be writing about this autumn is understanding the Sarah customary. That's the sort of ritual details of how things were done in Salisbury Cathedral with Old Sarah, which is the key foundation to understanding the ritual of Salisbury. But you get those processions that just go out into the nave and back again, those that go in various routes around the cathedral, those that go around the cloisters as well, roads that go around the outside of the church, those that go around the outside of the churchyard, and the rare ones which go to another church and what they sing, which is specified and includes litanies, certainly, because litanies are very good. You can go on repeating them. And there, you need call and response. We discovered this. Yes, actually, Palm Sunday at Bangor Cathedral, where we were half a verse out by the time we got into the cathedral, with all glory, Lord, and honour. And I thought, I know why All Glory, Lord, and Honour now has solo verses, then refrain for everybody, because you have those moments of when you sing with some of the festive dies. It's a lesson in that. I think civic processions, so far as the church is concerned, the moment is when they arrive at the principal door of the church, whether that's the west door or an old cell, the south door. And that's where you find endless references in monasteries and in cathedrals to either the college of priests or the monastic community meet that person and sing Te Deum. And that's most often when you get references to the organs and solemnity, which did you have solemnity of the organs? Yes, you did at one of your, I think it was a French reference, Bishop Besançon. And I think that, who worked on Henry VIII American? Dana Marsh, raised this question at a conference in Oxford in 2007 where there were references to trumpets, and he was trying to argue that they might have been used in church in the Te Deum, and I'm still sceptical of that. I think there's more work to be done on this, and I think what we heard about the Brabant example was very interesting about those instruments shown there in the pre-Reformation church. But agreed, I think there's a much bigger question about what did the waits play, because after all, the waits were the people who, after the Reformation, early 17th century, the Oxford waits were employed in the cathedral to provide cornet and sackbut on feast days, when you do get the choir and the voices, choir and instruments combining.
There's a fair bit in Reed, isn't there, on waits? I mean, the
Oh,
Reed
yes.
got, and in Coventry as well, the cathedral singing men also act as the civic waits during the 1570s.
Yeah.
So there's quite a lot of slippage of sort of personnel and.
Yes, I think it's what the problem comes about when you get to repertory, which is very useful, saying, and I think we've got to work on that, and what Roger thinks about all this.
I was always struck by the fact that when you look at the Canterbury Cathedral accounts, the sackbut players are educated and consigned for their pay, but the cornet players were illiterate and could only put a cross by their names in the accounts, which suggested that although cornets and sackbuts might very well have been welcome in the great churches on great occasions, they were there to play their fanfares or what have you from their memorised repertory, that the cornet players, certainly Canterbury, were never other than simple illiterates who could never have been able to read music. The sackbut players likewise only put a cross for their signatures until 1625, and then all of a sudden you get new personnel with the most elegant, educated signatures, and it's perfectly possible to believe that these sackbut players were educated, could read music, and I suspect probably were involved in the performance of polyphonic anthems and services to strengthen the bass line, bearing in mind that the English organ had no pedal department.
Yeah.
So it was a festal occasion.
Yes, I wouldn't agree about that last remark, because you've got the diapason, which is sounding at 16 foot pitch. But in other respects, I think that's interesting. I'll leave that there.
I think it's still true that most people, when they deal with the soundscape, they tend to focus on one or another aspect, isn't it? I mean, we've heard papers that really address liturgical music, we've heard papers that address ballads, we've heard that other historians like John Craig look at the sort of incidental sounds in churches. Then there are others who work more on the sort of secular music, which I think we've heard very little about, the sort of church choral music, the minstrels, the dancing days that Salisbury actually did. So I would be really interested to hear about these interactions between all of these people who create, because I think otherwise we'll have a partial idea. And I think, you know, you were coming closest, I think, on sort of trying to, you know, give us a sort of comprehensive view of how this might have sounded on particular days. I think, you know, the soundscape must have been absolutely deafening. Cacophony, you know, of all sorts of secular
And you see
sounds.
some kind of regulation. For instance, when the choir was installed, there was a regulation made up, and the foreign priests, and there must have been some 15, 20 in the church on the feast day, were forbidden to sing masses when the choir had to perform.
Right.
So,
You get the same thing in Hereford Cathedral, where the parish church is the other side of the screen from, and there is protests there for disturbance the parish services of the main pattern of cathedral worship. I mean, I think one of the things that could be a useful follow-on when we come to this back is actually to look at one conurbation, you know, and get a group of people who are prepared to talk. Because I think inevitably when we're giving papers, you know, you're going to focus on, particularly the short papers, you cannot actually go more than just look at one aspect.
But would that be a great sort of idea, you know, to sort of try and actually do this for one place where we bring all these, you know, people together and try and, as it were, do an experience of sound, you know, rather than worship, as it were. I think that would be, you know, a very interesting experiment to do. Okay, other questions? I'm aware that people have trains to catch, etc. So at some stage, or you know, planes to catch, or whatever. One thing, if there are no further questions, obviously I would like to thank everybody who's participated, everybody who's helped in the preparations. I would like to pick up on John's point when he said we need somewhere to collate data, we need somewhere to perhaps exchange ideas. I mean, that's one thing that, you know, we're trying to offer to the sort of parish scholar community, is this My Parish platform where there is unlimited place for data. And one thing that we're going to have will be a really big database of church wardens accounts data, which will be coming up here. But I think it'd be lovely to hear, you know, all these sorts of things we've heard today and I didn't know existed. It'd be great. It's very simple to register. You can just click on new and post ideas or sources or questions, and it would be great if that kind of thing could perhaps be, you know, also an outcome of today. Next year, we're hoping to do possibly a collaboration with the Warwickshire Local History Society, because both that society and the university will have 50-year anniversaries. So there may be some scope for collaboration there. But we'll, you know, keep obviously listening to you, what kinds of themes you would like to hear, and whether there is scope for workshops outside of the regular symposium schedule. So, just to thank everybody for their participation, to thank you for all the ideas that we've heard about, to thank you for your support of the symposium, and hopefully it would be okay if we put the list of participants on the website and the abstracts. Yeah. Hopefully we'll also have some edited audio from today, and maybe also the keywords that people have put on their registration form, so that at least we have a little record of what happened today. And otherwise, you know, thank you for coming, and hopefully we'll see you again.
Thank you.